The dawn bell hadn't finished ringing before Kaelyth Vhorren's blade was already moving. She came in low, crest feathers flattened hard against her skull, the way every Vhaster went flat and sleek when the blood was up. 41 mornings she had done this. 41 mornings, the human had done exactly what he did now. Shifted his weight a hand's width to the left, let her practice edge whisper past his ribs close enough to stir the fabric of his jacket, and put 2 fingers against the flat of her blade to guide it wide of his body like he was closing a door someone had left open. "Point," said Master of Blades Vhorren from the edge of the sand ring, in the bored voice of a man who had called the same word at the same hour for 6 straight weeks. "No touch. Reset." Kaelyth didn't reset. She spun instead, closing the distance again before her own boots had finished landing, driving a strike toward Eli Draycott's collarbone that would have ended the bout against any other cadet in the yard. He didn't block it so much as decline it, dropping his shoulder a fraction, letting her blade travel the extra 2 inches of air her wrist hadn't accounted for, and then he was behind her, one hand resting, not gripping, resting against her sword arm. "Point," Vhorren said again, flatter this time. "Second no touch, reset." The other cadets, ringing the sand, had stopped pretending to stretch. 40, 50 of them, feathered and scaled and chitined and skinned in every shade the Combine had on offer, all watching the same thing they watched every dawn. The Vhaster girl who could not lose a rank duel losing, over and over, to the human who would not throw a single offensive strike. Kaelyth's crest went from flat black to a hot, humiliated orange, the color climbing her scalp ridge like a struck match. "Fight me," she said, not loud. She never said it loud. It came out low and even, which was somehow worse, because everyone in the Combine knew a Vhaster who kept her voice level while her crest burned. That color was a Vhaster standing at the very edge of something. "I am fighting you," Eli said. He wasn't even breathing hard. 17 years old, human-built, a full head shorter than she was and a third her reach, and he stood in the ring with the loose, unbothered stance of someone waiting for a bus. "You're just losing to yourself." The crest went from orange to a red so dark it looked wet. She came at him a third time, not a dual strike now, not a rank board move at all, just raw motion, both hands, no more finesse than a felled tree, and the yard held its breath, because everyone understood that if she landed this one, rules or no rules, it wouldn't be a point that got scored. Eli caught her wrist an inch from his throat, turned it a bare 15 degrees, and used her own momentum to put her on one knee in the sand. He let go before anyone could call it a throw. "Bout's over," Vhorren said, stepping between them at last, his old scarred crest a flat, professional gray. 41-0, no touches scored either side, same as yesterday, same as the day before that. He looked down at Kaelyth, not unkindly, the way a man looks at a good blade he has watched notch itself against the same stone too many times. "Get up, second blade, muster's over." Kaelyth got up. She did not look at the ranking board bolted to the yard's east wall, where her name sat exactly where it had sat for 6 weeks. Second Blade Vhorren, K, one line below a name that made no sense sitting where it sat. First Blade Draycott, E. A human, ranked first, in a combat academy built by 11 species over 300 years, specifically to measure who could take a life fastest and cleanest, and he had never once tried to take anyone's. Arden Combine Institute occupied the spine of Kesho anchorage the way a keel occupies a ship. Everything else, the mess halls and the dormitory rings and the observation decks that looked out on the slow turning dark, was built around it and depended on it holding. 900 cadets from 40-some worlds trained inside its ribs, and every one of them on arrival learned the same first lesson. Rank in the yard was not a suggestion. It decided your billet, your instructors, your seat at assembly, and for a Vhaster cadet specifically, whose whole culture ran on the proving, whether your family's name climbed or slid in front of the only people whose opinion had ever mattered to you. Kaelyth's family's name was Vhorren. Her mother was War-Matriarch Sora Vhorren, who had ended the Threban blockade with 4 ships, and a decision nobody else on the command deck had been willing to make, and who had not told her daughter she was proud of her in 11 years. Not because she wasn't. Kaelyth understood, intellectually, in the part of her mind that stayed calm, but because Sora Vhorren did not deal in things that weren't yet earned. The proving was 9 days away. It came to Arden once a cycle, when the instructors opened the yard to formal challenge with live edges instead of practice steel. Safety wards keyed into the ring floor to arrest a killing, strike a finger width from flesh, and every clan with a cadet enrolled sent someone to watch. This cycle, for the first time since Kaelyth had enrolled, her mother was coming in person. She found this out the way she found out most things about her mother secondhand, from a comm relay posted to the family channel, 4 lines long, no greeting. Attending the proving, expect First Blade contested. Do not embarrass the line. Kaelyth read it twice in the corridor outside the mess hall, her thumb pressed hard enough against the data slate that the surface warmed under her skin, and then she closed the message and went to breakfast like it hadn't put a hole in her chest the size of a fist. Expect First Blade contested. Her mother assumed, reasonably, that a cadet 6 weeks from the proving who had held Second Blade against a human for 41 straight mornings intended to close that gap before the whole Combine was watching. Kaelyth intended exactly that. She had intended it every single morning. She simply had not, in 41 tries, worked out how a person was supposed to beat someone who refused to fight her. Blade Kaelyth watched the muster end from the shade of the eastern colonnade, arms folded, crest a controlled, patient blue-gray that gave away nothing at all. He was Third Blade, had been Third Blade for 2 cycles, immovable, because the only 2 cadets above him spent their mornings failing to score against each other instead of against him, which meant the board never had a reason to reshuffle. It was, Threll had decided some weeks ago, the single most useful accident in the history of the yard. "She's going to break something," said Ovid, his roommate, a broad-shouldered Karsuvi cadet with plated gray skin and no patience for subtlety. "Before or after the human breaks her, I mean." "Neither," Threll said. "That's the interesting part. Nobody breaks, it just resets. Forever, apparently. You've been watching a lot of mornings, you don't have to watch. I like understanding things that don't make sense." Threll pushed off the colonnade pillar and started toward the armory wing, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that took real practice. A First Blade who won't fight and a Second Blade who can't win is bad for every clan on the station whose cadet sits below them honestly, mine especially. His crest didn't so much as flicker when he said it, which was, for a V-haster, its own kind of tell. 9 days. Somebody should make sure the proving actually proves something. Ovid didn't ask what he meant. Ovid had learned over 2 cycles rooming with a Kaelyth that it was safer not to. The Draycott bunk sat at the human end of Ring 4, third door, a narrow rectangle of a room that Eli shared with a wiry engineering track cadet named Petra Lindqvist, who had opinions about everything and enough sense to keep most of them to herself until after curfew. 41, Petra said that night, not looking up from the drive coil she was rebuilding on her bunk. I did the math, that's 5.5 weeks of a girl trying to put a blade through you every single morning, and you standing there like a lamppost. I'm not standing there like a lamppost. You are extremely lamppost energy, Eli. It's not an insult. Lampposts are load-bearing. She twisted a coil into place, didn't look up. You could beat her. Everyone in the yard knows you could beat her. Vhorren knows it. I know it, and I've never held a sword in my life. So why don't you? Eli sat on his own bunk with a maintenance manual open across his knees that he hadn't turned a page of in 10 minutes. "Because winning isn't the point," he said. "That's what people say right before they lose on purpose to seem noble." "I'm not losing." He said it without heat, the same flat certainty he'd used in the ring that morning. "I'm not losing and I'm not winning. I'm just not finishing it." Petra set the coil down. That's not an answer. That's a rank higher than an answer where you get to sound wise without saying anything. He almost told her then. It sat right at the back of his teeth, the way it always did when someone pushed at exactly that seam. His grandfather's voice, 6 years old now in memory, saying a strike you can't take back isn't a technique, Eli, it's a decision, and you don't get to make it twice. But the words that would have explained Kaelyth Vhorren's crest going that dark, humiliated red every single morning weren't his to hand out for free, not even to Petra, so what he said instead was, "Ask me again after the proving." Petra studied him for a second, decided correctly that this was as far as the door was going to open tonight, and went back to her coil. 2 mornings later, Kaelyth changed her strategy, and it went worse. She'd spent the night before running drills against the yard's practice frame instead of sleeping, working a new opening. A false low line meant to draw his weight forward before she reversed into a real strike from the other side, a sequence her mother had used to end the Threban engagement. According to the one account of it Kaelyth had ever managed to find and had read enough times to have it by memory. It worked exactly as well as it was supposed to, right up until the reversal, at which point Eli did something he had not done in 41 mornings. He didn't wait for her blade to arrive and decline it at the last instant. He moved early, half a beat before her reversal even finished, closing the gap she hadn't expected closed, and put himself so close to her that her blade had nowhere left to travel, no room to complete the strike, no room to do anything except stop. For 1 full second, chest to chest, close enough that she could see the small, human-strange gray flecks in his eyes, neither of them moved. "Your weight comes forward on the reversal," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Every time, not just today." Then he stepped back, and the second was gone, and Vhorren was calling no touch, reset, same as always, and the yard was murmuring the way it murmured every morning about the girl who couldn't win. But Kaelyth stood in the sand with her pulse going hard in her throat for a different reason than the one everyone assumed, because in 6 weeks of losing to him in front of the entire combine, that was the first time he had ever told her, out loud, exactly what she was doing wrong. She turned the sentence over for the rest of the day like a coin she couldn't decide whether to spend. "Your weight comes forward on the reversal. Every time. Not just today." Not just today meant he'd seen it before. Meant he'd known, for however many mornings, precisely the flaw that was costing her, and had said nothing, and had gone on decisively not losing to her without ever once using what he knew to actually beat her. That should have made her angrier. It didn't. It made something colder and more complicated sit down in her chest instead, and she didn't have a name for it yet, and she resented that too. The days after that ran together into a rhythm Arden's other cadets had started calling, not unkindly, the standoff, a small daily spectacle that the whole yard arranged itself around without meaning to, the way a room arranges itself around a fireplace. Day 43. Kaelyth tried a feint she'd never used before, and Eli read it in the first quarter-second and simply wasn't where the feint expected him to be when it finished, and offered no comment at all, and she went to breakfast furious that his silence bothered her as much as his correction had. Day 45. A Tareshi cadet named Asu, who ranked well below both of them and had exactly nothing to lose, tried to bait Eli into an off-book duel after muster, mocking loud, calling him a coward in 3 languages. Eli looked at him for a second too long to be comfortable, said, "No," and walked away. And it was Kaelyth, not Vhorren, not anyone official, who stepped into Asu's path afterward and told him, in a voice that ended the conversation before it restarted, that if he wanted to test First Blade's patience, he could put his name on the challenge board like everyone else instead of running his mouth in the yard. She didn't examine too closely why she'd done it. She told herself it was about the honor of the ranking system, that a challenge board meant nothing if cadets could be goaded outside it. She mostly believed that. Day 47. Vhorren pulled her aside after muster, his old crest holding at its usual patient gray, and said, without preamble, "You're better than you were 6 weeks ago." "I haven't scored a touch in 6 weeks." "I didn't say you'd won anything. I said you were better." He nodded once toward the board. "Watch him instead of yourself for a morning. See what happens." She didn't understand the instruction until day 49, when she finally did what he'd said, stopped tracking her own footwork, her own openings, and simply watched, for the length of one bout, exactly where Eli chose to put his feet, and found, buried under 6 weeks of frustration, something that looked almost like a lesson if she tilted her head at it right. He never moved more than he had to. Not once. Every correction of her line, every redirection of her blade, cost him the absolute minimum motion the geometry allowed, and not 1 inch more. It wasn't caution. She had assumed, for 6 weeks, that it was caution, or fear of what happened to a human who actually crossed a Vhorren's blade in earnest. Assumptions she was ashamed of now that she looked at them directly, because nothing about how he moved looked afraid. It looked like control so total it had stopped needing to prove itself. That frightened her more than his skill did. A cadet who was simply better than her, she could have understood, could have trained against, could have eventually caught. A cadet who had already decided on some level she couldn't see into exactly how much of himself he was willing to spend on her. That wasn't a rival. That was something else, and she didn't have a category for it yet. Vhorren found Eli alone at the practice frame 2 mornings later, well before the bell, running the same unshowy 3-motion sequence Kaelyth had once caught him running in the half-dark. The master of blades didn't announce himself. He watched for the length of 11 repetitions, which was, for a man who had spent 4 cycles evaluating cadets in half a glance, an unusually long look. "You've never asked me why I don't correct your drilling," Vhorren said finally. Eli didn't break the sequence. "I figured you had a reason. I had a cadet once, on a station that isn't on the charts anymore, who could do everything you do." Vhorren's crest held its habitual gray, but something in his voice had lost its parade ground flatness. "Faster hands than yours, if I'm honest. Better instincts. I graded him First Blade at 16 and told his clan he'd be War Marshal material inside a decade. And I meant every word of it, because grading cadets accurately was the only part of this job I'd ever been any good at." "What happened to him?" "He killed a boy in a sanctioned duel." Vhorren let the practice blade in his own hand drop to rest against his shoulder, an old habit that mirrored, without meaning to, the one Eli did without thinking. Not through malice, through exactly what you're careful never to have, a strike he could throw faster than he could decide whether to throw it. The wards caught it a fraction late that day too, if you want to know why I don't entirely trust old crystal even when the diagnostics say it's clean. Different flaw. Same result nearly. Except that day nobody stopped it in time, and the boy who died was 15. And my first blade spent the rest of his life being extremely good at something. He'd stopped being able to stand touching. Eli finally stopped the drill. "Is that why you never called it all these weeks, me not finishing bouts?" "I never called it because I recognized what you were doing about 4 mornings in, and I have spent 30 years wishing someone had recognized it in my own cadet before it cost him a boy's life instead of after." Vhorren's gray didn't shift, but he held Eli's gaze a beat longer than professional distance strictly required. "I'm not telling you this because I think you need convincing. I'm telling you because in 9 days, a woman who ended the Threban blockade is going to stand in that tier and watch her daughter fight you with a live edge. And I want you to understand that at least one instructor in this yard has already buried a cadet who didn't have what you have. Whatever happens on that sand, don't let anyone talk you into believing restraint was ever the weaker path." He left before Eli could answer, which was, Eli had learned over 6 weeks, exactly how Vhorren preferred to end a conversation that mattered. The pressure from outside the yard arrived less gently, 3 days after that, in the shape of a combine assembly proctor named Ves Andral, who had flown in from the Cadet Oversight Directorate on Ilvan Prime for the express purpose of asking Headmaster Vhorren questions nobody at Arden had wanted to answer out loud. 41 bouts, Proctor Andral said, laying a data slate on Vhorren's desk with the particular precision of someone who had rehearsed being unimpressed. No touches scored, either cadet, across 6 weeks, broadcast on the cadet training feeds every clan delegation on this anchorage subscribes to. Do you understand what that looks like to the Assembly, Headmaster? It looks like a combat academy built by 11 species to certify who can be trusted with a blade, has produced 2 cadets who have collectively decided the certification doesn't apply to them. It looks like restraint, Vhorren said. It looks like theater, and theater is being wagered on. I have the betting ledgers from 4 separate dormitory rings on my slate right now. Headmaster, cadets from 6 worlds running odds on which of your 2 ranking blades cracks first, and a formal inquiry from House Kaelyth's water rights delegation asking why a board that hasn't reshuffled in 2 cycles should be allowed to stand unchallenged into a proving that determines clans standing across this entire anchorage. Andral did not raise her voice, which somehow made it worse. I'm not asking you to fix a training exercise, Headmaster. I am telling you the Assembly has given this exactly until the proving to resolve itself, and if it does not, both rankings freeze pending a full directorate review, and Cadet Draycott human, unaffiliated with Combine clan law, no family standing to leverage on his behalf, gets reassigned to a training station that isn't sitting in the middle of a controversy the Assembly didn't sanction. Vhorren held the crest-still, careful expression of a man who had spent a long career translating Assembly threats into things his cadets never had to hear about directly. The proving is in 6 days. Then I'd encourage whoever's coaching those 2 to stop admiring the standoff and start resolving it, Andral said, and gathered her slate and left, and Vhorren sat alone in his office for a long moment before he called Vhorren in and told him, word for word, exactly what the Assembly had said, because some pressures, Vhorren had learned, were only survivable if the people standing closest to the blade knew exactly how sharp the political edge behind it actually was. Sora Vhorren's ship, the Warcutter Threben's Answer was not due at Kesho Anchorage until the morning of the proving itself. She sent one more message before then, 3 days out, and this one had 5 lines instead of 4. Second Blade is not a disgrace. Second Blade held 6 weeks against First is not, either. But I did not raise you to lose gracefully to a boy who will not raise his blade. Either he is beneath the rank he holds, and you should have exposed it by now, or he is not, and you have spent 6 weeks refusing to learn from the only cadet in that yard who might actually teach you something. I am not certain which failure worries me more. Kaelyth read that one exactly once. She did not read it twice, because the second time through, on the first pass, she had already understood that her mother, Sora Vhorren, who had ended a 3-year blockade with a decision nobody else would make, had said, in her own clipped, unsentimental way, something Kaelyth had been circling for a week without letting herself land on it. He might actually teach you something. She went to the yard early the next morning, before muster, before the bell, and found Eli already there, alone, running a slow, quiet drill against the practice frame that had nothing showy in it at all. Just the same 3 motions, over and over, feet resetting to the same 3 points in the sand like he was carving grooves into it. You're early, he said without turning around. So are you. I like it before everyone's watching. He finished the sequence, let the practice blade drop to rest against his shoulder, and finally looked at her. You want to ask me something? It wasn't a question. Kaelyth's crest went a shade paler than its resting color, which for her was as close to visible surprise as she allowed herself in front of people. Why do you correct me, she said, and then let me lose anyway? Eli was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. You're not losing to me, he said finally. You're losing to the fact that you think winning means putting me on the ground in front of your mother. That's not a fight I can fix by hitting you harder. It's not a fight anyone can fix from outside. He turned the practice blade over once in his hand, an old habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was deciding how much to say. The corrections are the only part I can actually help with. So that's the part I give you. And the rest? The rest is yours. He set the blade down against the frame. I'm not going to take that away from you by ending it for you in a way you didn't earn. She wanted to be angry at that. She had a whole practiced reservoir of anger built up over 6 weeks, sitting right behind her sternum, ready to be spent on exactly this kind of sentence, a human, 17 years old, telling of Vhorren what she had and hadn't earned. But the anger didn't come, because underneath the words there was something she recognized without wanting to. He had just described, in one breath, the exact shape of what her mother wanted from her, and had apparently understood it before Kaelyth had let herself understand it about her own mother. The proving isn't a yard bout, she said instead, because it was the only true thing she had left to offer him. There's no reset call at the proving. The blades are live. The wards stop a killing, strike a finger without, but everything short of killing counts, and it counts in front of everyone. I know how the proving works. Then you know that in 9 days, 6 now, I have to put my name on that board against someone, and if it isn't you, everyone in this combine will know exactly why. And if it is you, she stopped. If it is me, Eli said, you're afraid of what happens when there's no reset call to save either of us from it. The bell rang across the anchorage, distant, and the yard began filling in behind her with the ordinary shuffle and murmur of 600 cadets converging on their morning muster, and neither of them moved for one more second, both of them looking at a version of the next 6 days that had just gotten a great deal more complicated than either had said out loud. Petra Lindqvist noticed the discrepancy 4 days before the proving, and very nearly didn't mention it to anyone at all. She'd pulled the proving ring's maintenance manifest off the engineering track boards for an entirely unrelated reason. A class project on legacy stasis field architecture, the kind of assignment that made her genuinely happy in a way rebuilding drive coils never quite did, and found, buried 3 layers into the access logs, a third watch entry that didn't match anything on the posted maintenance schedule. Not a red flag by itself. Yalan quartermasters logged odd hours constantly, usually because they were covering for each other's debts instead of doing actual work. What made her pause was the resonance calibration file attached to that entry, timestamped, and then, 4 hours later, quietly resubmitted with a variant so small she almost scrolled past it. Half a step, on 4 of 12 stones, clustered with a symmetry that felt less like drift and more like a hand that knew exactly where to touch. She sat with the file open for 20 minutes, telling herself it was nothing, that she wasn't an engineer yet and didn't have the standing to flag a discrepancy in ceremonial-grade equipment. She barely understood that if it were real, someone with actual clearance would already have caught it. She almost closed the file 3 separate times. She didn't close it a 4th time. Instead, she copied the variance numbers onto a scrap of data slate and brought them to Eli that night, dropping them on his bunk without preamble. I don't know what this means, she said. I know it's not supposed to be there, and I know the only person with clearance and motive to have put it there in the last week is somebody who wants the board reshuffled badly enough to have been watching you two lose to each other for 6 weeks with a very particular kind of patience. Eli studied the numbers for longer than she expected. You should take this to Vhorren. I did. He forwarded it to Farron's office for review before the proving and told me the diagnostics crew would run a full sweep the morning of. Petra folded her arms, unconvinced by her own report. That's the system working the way it's supposed to work. I still don't like it. Neither do I, he handed the slate back. But I'll be watching the stones instead of just watching her. That's not nothing. It wasn't everything either, and both of them knew it. A diagnostic sweep built to catch stones that had failed outright had no particular reason to flag 4 stones a fraction off true, clustered exactly the way a careful hand would cluster them to look like nothing at all. But it was 4 days of warning that hadn't existed before, and Eli carried it into the proving morning, the way his grandfather had once told him to carry every uncertain thing, awake to it, without letting it become fear. Blade Kaelyth chose the Armory Wing's 3rd watch to do the work, because 3rd watch belonged to a Yalan quartermaster named Brask who owed him a debt from a supply discrepancy neither of them wanted logged, and Brask's idea of oversight was to be somewhere else entirely for 40 minutes at a stretch. The Proving Ring's ward stones lived under a floor panel in the ceremonial yard, 12 fist-sized crystals set in a circle, keyed to a resonance frequency that, when a blade's edge crossed within a finger width of exposed flesh, threw a stasis field hard enough to stop momentum cold. It was old technology, older than the Combine itself, borrowed from a dozen honor duel cultures that had learned the hard way what happened to alliances built on cadets accidentally killing each other during ceremony. Threll didn't disable the stones. Disabling them would trip a diagnostic the instructors ran the morning of every proving, and he had exactly no interest in being caught outright. What he did instead was smaller, and worse, in the way that small things done to safety systems are always worse. He retuned 4 of the 12 stones half a resonance step off true, not enough to fail a casual glance, not enough to stop the field from forming at all, just enough that the field, when it formed, would arrest a strike a fraction of a second later than it should. A finger width from flesh would become, in the moment that actually mattered, considerably less than a finger width. Whether that difference killed someone would depend entirely on how fast the blade was moving and how strong the arm behind it, which was, Threll reflected as he sealed the panel back into place, more or less the entire point of a duel between a Vhaster and a human in the first place. If it was Kaelyth's blade that got there first, and it would be, she was faster, stronger, and it was her name, not the humans, that had 11 straight bouts of building fury behind it, then the story the Combine told afterward would write itself. A human first blade, cut down at last by the second blade who'd finally stopped holding back. Tragic. Ordinary. Nobody would think to check the stones, because nobody expected a human's death in a sanctioned duel to be anything but the odds finally catching up to a species that had no business ranking above a Vhaster cadet to begin with. And if, against all sense, it went the other way, if the human somehow struck first, then a Vhorren would bleed out in front of her own mother on the ceremonial sand, which suited Threll's purposes almost as well. Either way, the board reshuffled. Either way, the accident that had frozen 3rd blade in place for 2 cycles finally ended. He closed the access panel, wiped it down, and went to breakfast. The Warcutter Threben's answer made anchor at Kesho 3 hours before the proving began, and War-Matriarch Sora Vhorren came down the boarding ramp in the same unadorned gray service coat she'd worn through 11 engagements. No honor guard, no announcement, because she had never in her career believed ceremony bought anything a decision hadn't already earned. Kaelyth met her at the transit platform because protocol demanded it, and stood at a precise, correct distance because 6 weeks of losing had at least sharpened her instinct for exactly how much space to leave around things that might still go wrong. "You look thinner," Sora said by way of greeting. "I've been training." "I can see that. It isn't showing up as strength." Her mother's crest sat at a flat, unreadable steel gray that Kaelyth had never once, in 17 years, learned to read past. "Tell me about the human." "First Blade Draycott." "I know his rank. I asked you to tell me about him." Kaelyth had rehearsed a dozen versions of this answer over 6 weeks, and discarded every one of them for sounding either bitter or defeated, neither of which she could afford in front of her mother 3 hours before the proving. What came out instead, when she actually opened her mouth, surprised her. He's the best duelist in this combine, she said. And he has spent 6 weeks proving it by not fighting me. Something moved behind Sora Vhorren's flat gray crest. Not a color shift, nothing so obvious, just a small stillness that Kaelyth had learned, across a childhood of scarce and precious attention, meant her mother had just heard something she hadn't expected. Explain that, Sora said. I don't fully understand it myself, Kaelyth said. But I intend to, before today ends. Her mother studied her for a long moment. The kind of assessment Kaelyth had watched her level at officers twice Kaelyth's age, weighing them the way you'd weigh a blade you hadn't decided yet whether to trust with your life. And then, for the first time since the message with 4 cold lines had landed on Kaelyth's data slate, something in Sora's posture eased, fractionally, the way a held breath finally lets go. Then go find out, she said, and Kaelyth. She said it as her daughter turned to go and Kaelyth stopped. Whatever happens on that sand today, I would rather you lose honestly to something you don't yet understand than win by pretending you already do. It was, by the standards of every message Kaelyth had ever received from her mother, nearly a declaration of love. The ceremonial yard filled faster than the ordinary yard ever did. 900 cadets and their clan delegations packed the tiered stone benches ringing the sand. Banners from 40 worlds hung from the colonnade, and at the center of it all the proving ring sat waiting, its 12 ward stones dark and quiet under the floor panel. 4 of them carrying a flaw no diagnostic had caught because no diagnostic had been built to look for 4 stones a half step off true, instead of 12 stones fully dead. Eli found Kaelyth at the ring's edge 20 minutes before the call, both of them already dressed for it. The ceremonial gear was lighter than practice armor, meant to be seen through, meant to let the crowd watch a duel happen rather than watch 2 suits of plate collide. Your mother's in the 3rd tier, he said, center block. I know where my mother is. I'm not telling you that to make you nervous. I'm telling you because you keep looking everywhere except there and it's making you worse, not better. He said it plainly, no unkindness in it, the same flat register he used for everything. Look at her once. Get it done. Then look at me instead because I'm the one you're actually fighting. Kaelyth looked. Sora Vhorren sat in the center block exactly where her rank entitled her, hands folded, crest unreadable at that distance, watching her daughter with an attention that felt, for once, like something other than judgment. Kaelyth looked away, back to the ring, back to Eli. 6 weeks, she said. You corrected my reversal on day 43. You corrected my footwork on day 49. You have never, not once, told me why you're doing it. You never asked me directly until 6 days ago. I'm asking now, before this, because I need to know whether the person I'm about to fight in front of everyone I have ever wanted to be proud of me is actually trying to help me or if he's just. Her voice, level for 6 weeks, finally cracked half a degree on the last word. If he's just being kind to something he thinks is beneath him. Eli looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, she'd cataloged his expressions across 41 mornings without meaning to. The way you learn a language you're forced to sit in shifted into a register she hadn't seen from him before. Not the flat calm, something underneath it. There was a kid on my colony, he said, named Cole. We were 12. We got into it over something so stupid I genuinely don't remember what it was anymore, and I hit him once, full strength, no control, because I hadn't learned control yet and I was angry and he was right there. Broke his collarbone in 2 places. Nothing that killed him, nothing that even scarred in the end. But I remember the sound it made better than I remember anything else from that whole year, and I remember that the second after I heard it, I couldn't take it back. There wasn't a reset call. There wasn't a redo. It just happened, and then it was permanent, and I had to live next to what I'd done for the rest of that year because his family didn't move and neither did mine. That isn't why you don't fight. It's exactly why I don't fight anyone I'm not sure I need to. His voice stayed even, but something in it had gone very deliberate, like a man walking a line he'd walked before and still respected. My grandfather trained me after that, not to hit harder, to stop needing to. He used to say a strike you can't take back isn't a technique, it's a decision, and you don't get to make it twice. I believed him before I understood him. I understand him now. He looked at her, steady, unhurried, the same look he'd worn every single morning in the yard. You've never once, in 41 bouts, been trying to kill me, Kaelyth. You've been trying to prove something to a woman in the third tier who already decided 6 weeks ago that you were worth watching. I wasn't going to be the strike that took that chance away from you before you'd earned it yourself. The call horn sounded across the yard, once, long and low, and the crowd's noise dropped to the particular held-breath quiet of 900 people who had been waiting all cycle for exactly this. Ring positions, Vhorren's voice carried, amplified, flat with ceremony. Second Blade Vhorren, First Blade Draycott, live edge, proving rules. Kaelyth stepped onto the sand. Eli stepped onto the sand across from her. And for the first time in 41 mornings, neither of them was in the yard anymore. The wards hummed to life around the ring's perimeter, a thin blue shimmer at ankle height that every cadet present had been trained since their first cycle to trust without thinking about 400 years of honor duel technology standing between ceremony and tragedy, silent, invisible, and this once, quietly wrong. Kaelyth opened with the false low line, the one she'd built specifically for this, the one that had failed against him on day 43 because her weight came forward on the reversal. Except this time she didn't reverse. She let the feint hang a half-second longer than instinct wanted, watched him start to shift into the space her old pattern would have vacated, and struck through the gap that opened instead. It was, by every standard the yard had ever measured her against, the best strike of her life. Eli read it a fifth of a second too late, not because he was slow, but because 6 weeks of studying her forehand had taught his instincts a rhythm she had just deliberately broken. He got his blade up. He got his weight moving the right direction. He did everything a duelist with his skill was supposed to do against an opponent who had finally outthought him. It wasn't enough. Her live edge crossed the line where the ward field should have caught it a finger width from his collarbone, exactly where Cole Bristow's had broken 5 years and 1 lifetime ago, and the field did catch it. The blue shimmer flared. The air took on that particular held static tension of a stasis charge discharging, but a half-beat slower than it should have. 4 stones out of 12 carrying a flaw nobody had built the diagnostics to find, and in that half-beat her blade was still moving. Eli felt it. Not thought it, felt it. The way his grandfather had trained him to feel a room's temperature change before anyone in it said a word. Some old animal sense that had kept him alive through a childhood he didn't like to talk about telling him, in the space of a heartbeat, that the wall he had trusted his whole time at Arden to be there had a hole in it. He did the thing he had not done in 41 mornings, in 6 weeks, in longer than that if he was honest about it. He stopped declining. His free hand came up and closed over her sword hand at the wrist, not to redirect her blade this time. There wasn't room left for redirection. The geometry had already collapsed to nothing. But to physically arrest the last half-beat of her strike with his own strength and his own body, turning what would have been a killing line into a shallow drag of the edge across his forearm instead, close enough to the bone that he felt it, not close enough to end anything. The stasis field caught up a fraction of a second later and locked both their blades in place, humming, useless, 400 years too late to matter. For 1 full second, nobody in the ceremonial yard made a sound. Then Kaelyth looked down, at his hand locked around her wrist, at the shallow red line opening across his forearm where her live edge had gone in an inch when it should have gone in none, at the stasis field glowing a half-beat behind where it should have caught her, and every color drained out of her crest at once, leaving it a stark, sick white that Vhorren physiology reserved for exactly one thing. Terror, not at him, at what her own hand had almost done. The medics reached the ring before the crowd's noise even finished breaking open into chaos, Vhorren's voice cutting across it, hard and commanding, ordering the ring cleared, and the field diagnostics pulled immediately. And Eli let the medic press a sealant patch against his forearm without taking his eyes off Kaelyth, who hadn't moved, whose sword arm was still raised in the position it had frozen in, whose whole body had gone rigid in a way 6 weeks of watching her lose gracefully had never once shown him. Kaelyth, he said her name the way he'd never said it in the yard, quiet, direct, cutting through whatever was happening behind that white crest. Look at me. It's shallow. I'm fine. The ward was late. Her voice came out flat and strange, the voice of someone doing arithmetic she couldn't make balance. The wards are never late. They've never once been late. In 300 years of provings they are not late, so either the diagnostics this morning were wrong or somebody made them wrong, Eli said. Kaelyth's crest, already stripped to white, went somehow paler. In the third tier, Sora Vhorren was already on her feet, and she did not look like a woman watching a duel anymore. She looked like a woman who had spent 30 years learning to identify the exact moment a battlefield stopped being an accident, and had just found it. Vhorren's diagnostic crew had the floor panel open within 4 minutes. Proving protocol demanded it the instant any ward performance fell outside tolerance. No exceptions, not even for a War-Matriarch's presence in the stands, and the tech who ran the resonance scan across all 12 stones went very still very fast, because 4 of them were reading half a step off true, a deviation so specific and so evenly spaced around the circle that it could not, by any honest accounting, be an accident of age or wear. Somebody tuned these, the tech said, loud enough for the ring to hear, because in the wake of what had almost happened, nobody in that yard was interested in whispering about it anymore. Deliberately, recently. This isn't drift. Kaelyth was still staring at the 4 flagged stones when something in her expression changed, the white terror folding, in real time, into something colder and more focused. The same look Eli had watched her wear in the yard on the mornings she was actually thinking instead of just fighting. "Third watch," she said, half to herself. "The panel access log only clears for third watch personnel and instructors with ceremonial clearance." She turned to Vhorren, who logged access to this ring in the last 4 days. Vhorren's crew pulled the log in under a minute. Arden's systems were old but honest, and nobody had thought to scrub an access record because nobody had expected anyone to look this hard, this fast. At a routine safety failure, everyone would otherwise have chalked up to bad luck and an unlucky Vhorren temper. One name sat in the log 3 nights running. At exactly the hour third watch oversight went unattended. Kaelyth read it once. She didn't need to read it twice. "Threll Kaelyth," she said, and her voice had stopped shaking entirely. "Bring him to the ring." They brought him. He came with his crest already schooled to that same patient blue-gray he'd worn on the colonnade 9 days earlier, arms folded, and for one moment, one long, dangerous moment, with a live-edge blade still in her hand, and a shallow cut across her opponent's forearm still weeping through its sealant patch, Kaelyth understood exactly how easy it would be to become the story Threll had built this whole scheme to tell. The Vhorren girl finally provoked past composure, striking down a rival cadet in front of the whole combine. She set her blade down in the sand instead, deliberately, both hands empty, and looked at him. "You retuned 4 stones," she said. "Third watch 3 nights this week. Brask shift, who owes you enough that he made sure to be elsewhere for it." Threll's blue-gray didn't so much as flicker, which told her, more than any confession could have, that she'd read it exactly right. "I don't know what you're describing," he said. "You don't have to know. The access log knows." She let that sit a second, watching the first hairline crack show at the edge of his composure, not his crest. He was too controlled for that, but the stillness in his jaw, the half-second too long before he answered. "You wanted a board that reshuffled. You've wanted it for 2 cycles. Ever since your clan lost the water rights arbitration to mine, and you decided the only honest thing left to hate about it was that I outrank you and the human outranks both of us. So you built a version of the proving where either I killed him in front of my mother, or he finally killed me, and either way Third Blade stopped being frozen behind two names that wouldn't fight each other honestly. That's an elaborate accusation for a training accident. It would be, Sora Vhorren said, arriving at the ring's edge with the particular unhurried weight of someone who had never once in her career needed to raise her voice to be heard. If the log weren't sitting open on that text slate for every clan delegation in this yard to read for themselves. She looked at Blade Kaelyth with an expression that made even Vhorren, a man who had trained cadets for 4 cycles and feared very little, take half a step back. I have ended blockades with less evidence than 4 mistoon stones, and a log with your name on it 3 nights running, cadet. Choose your next sentence with more care than your last one. Threll didn't get to choose a next sentence at all. 2 of the ceremonial marshals were already moving, and his crest, at last, at the very end, flushed a raw, exposed red that had nothing composed left in it. Matriarch Kaelyth arrived at the ceremonial yard within the hour, summoned by a relay that House Kaelyth's own retainers had sent before the marshals had finished escorting her son away. And she came the way Vhaster clan heads always came when a child's disgrace threatened to become a clan's disgrace. Fast, armored in formality, already building the version of events that would cost her house the least. This is a training accident being retried as treason, she said, planting herself at the ring's edge with a delegation of 4 behind her, her own crest a controlled, ice-pale blue that Kaelyth recognized instantly, because it was the exact color Thrells had worn on the colonnade 9 days ago. My son retuned instruments he had clearance to service under a quartermaster's negligent oversight. That is a disciplinary matter for Arden's engineering board, not an assembly inquiry, and I will not stand here and watch House Kaelyth standing gutted over 4 crystals a fraction out of calibration. 4 crystals clustered with a precision drift doesn't happen by negligence, Matriarch, Sora said. She hadn't raised her voice either, which was, Kaelyth had come to understand over one very long day, exactly how the most dangerous people in her mother's world argued. It happens by a hand that knew precisely how much error a stone could carry before a diagnostic noticed. Your son didn't stumble into that number. He calculated it. You would say that. Your daughter benefits from his ruin. My daughter nearly killed a boy who has never once raised a blade against her in earnest, because your son wanted a rank board reshuffled badly enough to gamble both their lives on a coin flip. He'd rigged to favor his own ambitions either way it landed. Something in Sora's flat gray crest did shift then, not to any color Kaelyth had a name for, but to a stillness that made even the Kaelyth retainer step back half a pace. I have buried officers for less calculated recklessness than what your son did to that ring, Matriarch. I am, at this moment, exercising considerably more restraint than the Threban blockade required of me. I would not test how much of it is left. It was Vhorren, in the end, who ended the standoff between the 2 women the way assembly protocol actually demanded, by invoking the Directorate's jurisdiction over any incident involving cross-species cadet safety, which took the matter out of clan hands entirely and put it into a formal inquiry neither House Kaelyth nor House Vhorren could resolve through influence alone. Matriarch Kaelyth left the ceremonial yard with her delegation intact and her son already in assembly custody, and if anything in her bearing suggested, she understood exactly how much damage a rigged half-step of resonance calibration had actually done to her houses standing across 40 clans who had all just watched the log read out in public. She did not let it show in front of Sora Vhorren. She would not be the last visitor House Kaelyth sent to Arden before the inquiry closed, but she was the only one who came expecting to win the argument. They didn't restart the proving that day. Nobody expected them to. Vhorren called it formally from the center of the ring, voice carrying to every tier. The bout suspended pending combine inquiry. Both blades' honor preserved intact. The ranking board frozen exactly where it stood until the inquiry concluded. First Blade Draycott and Second Blade Vhorren both commended for conduct that had, in his words, done more for this yard's honor in 4 minutes of crisis than most cadets manage in 4 cycles of clean bouts. It was near dusk before the ceremonial yard finally emptied, marshals and delegations and gossip all draining away toward the dormitory rings, and Kaelyth found Eli sitting alone on the lowest tier of stone benches, his forearm freshly re-wrapped. Watching the last of the crowd disperse with the same unhurried stillness he brought to everything. She sat down beside him without asking. "You said before the horn sounded that I'd never once been trying to kill you." She looked at the wrapped cut on his arm rather than at his face. "I nearly did today." "You nearly did today because someone else made sure of it. That's different." He turned his arm over, testing the wrap, wincing faintly at the pull of it. "You didn't flinch when you thought the wards had failed. You went straight to who could have done it and how. That's not the reaction of someone who wanted this." "I want to understand something," Kaelyth said. 41 mornings. You corrected 2 flaws in 6 weeks and let the rest of me stay broken, and I told myself that was restraint, or mercy, or maybe just you not caring enough to finish something. I don't think it was any of those anymore." "It wasn't." "Then what was it?" Eli was quiet for a moment, turning the question over the way he turned things over before he answered them. A habit she'd catalogued without meaning to, across 41 mornings that had somehow, without her noticing the exact moment it happened, stopped being an ordeal and started being the part of the day she least wanted to lose. "You've spent your whole life being measured by one woman whose approval you've never once heard out loud," he said. "I've watched you try to earn it by beating me since the first morning I stood in that ring. If I'd let you win a hollow one thrown about, taken a fall I didn't need to take, you'd have known. Somewhere under the relief, you'd have known, and it would have cost you more than losing honestly ever did. And if I'd actually tried to put you down the way I could have, every single morning in front of everyone, I'd have handed your mother a reason to measure you against a version of yourself that had already failed in public, before you were ready for anyone but yourself to see it." He looked at her directly, for once without the flat neutrality he wore like armor in the yard. "So I gave you what I could actually give you honestly, the corrections. The truth when you finally asked for it straight. And the rest of it, the actual winning, the actual becoming whoever you're going to become instead of who your mother already is, that part was never mine to hand you. It still isn't." Kaelyth sat with that for a long moment, the dusk light going gold and then gray across the empty ring, the ward stones dark now, disconnected, waiting for the inquiry to clear them for repair. "My mother told me this morning that she would rather I lost honestly to something I didn't understand than win by pretending I already did," she said finally. "I didn't understand what she meant until about 4 minutes ago. And now I think," Kaelyth said, "that I have spent 6 weeks losing to the only cadet in this combine who was never actually my opponent." She looked at him, and for the first time since day one, her crest held at a color she hadn't shown him before, not the flattened black of readiness, not the humiliated orange or the murderous dark red or the sick, terrified white. Something quieter. Something that, in Vhorren physiology, a cadet as controlled as Kaelyth Vhorren almost never let anyone see, because it meant exactly what it looked like it meant. "I'd like you to actually train me, not correct me between bouts I'm still trying to win against you." "Train me." "That's not the yard's arrangement." "I don't care what the yard's arrangement is. I outrank the yard's arrangement, or I will, the day this inquiry finishes clearing my name and yours." Something almost like a smile moved at the edge of her mouth, the first one he'd seen from her in 6 weeks that wasn't aimed at hiding something else underneath it. 41 mornings, Draycott. I think I've earned knowing what you actually know." Sora Vhorren left Kesho Anchorage 4 days later, Once the inquiry had closed, Blade Kaelyth's clan censured, his cadetship revoked, the ward stones rebuilt from the crystal up under a new oversight protocol that made third watch tampering considerably harder for the next cadet who thought a rank board was worth someone's life. And before she boarded the transit shuttle back to Threben's answer asterisk, she found her daughter in the yard at dawn, alone with the human cadet, running a drill that had nothing to do with rank at all. She watched for a while without announcing herself, the way she watched everything, cataloging. Kaelyth's footwork had changed in 4 days. Not dramatically, nothing about real skill changed dramatically, but the weight that had always crept forward on her reversal held steady now, and when Eli called a correction, quiet, economical, the same 2 or 3 words he'd used for 6 weeks, Kaelyth didn't grimace at it the way she once had. She adjusted and reset and ran it again, and something in the rhythm of the two of them working together instead of at each other looked, to a woman who had spent 30 years learning to read exactly this kind of thing across a command deck, less like a rivalry that had ended and more like one that had simply become honest. "You were wrong once," Sora said, when the drill finally broke and both cadets turned to find her standing at the edge of the sand. "You said he taught you nothing in 6 weeks. I remember the message." "I didn't say that." "You implied it, badly." Her mother's crest sat at its usual unreadable steel gray, but something in her posture this morning had lost the flat formality Kaelyth had worn as a second skin for as long as she could remember. "I was wrong about something too. I told you not to embarrass the line. I should have told you the line survives being lost to if it's lost to something worth learning. I didn't have the words for that until I watched a boy a third your size hold a blade off your throat with his bare hand, instead of taking the win that was sitting right there for the asking." She looked at Eli directly then, for the first time since arriving at Arden 9 days ago, an assessment as level and unhurried as anything she'd ever given a fleet officer. "First Blade Draycott, my daughter tells me you're going to train her properly now." "If she'll have the training, ma'am." "She will." Sora's crest shifted, half a shade, the smallest fraction of color Kaelyth had ever seen her allow in public, something that wasn't quite pride, not yet, but was standing very close to where pride would eventually get built. "See that you finish what you started 41 mornings ago. All of it this time, not just the parts that were safe to give her." She turned to go, then stopped and looked back at her daughter one more time. "Second Blade," she said, "is not a disgrace, Kaelyth, it never was. But I think by the time this cycle ends, that board is going to need a new name at the top of it, and I think for the first time in your life, you're going to have earned it honestly instead of needing it to prove something to me." Something in her voice, clipped and unsentimental as ever, still managed to land like the thing Kaelyth had been waiting 17 years to hear. "That's the part I was actually watching for, not the rank." That. She left for the transit platform without waiting for an answer, because Sora Vhorren had never in her life needed the last word to know she'd been heard. The yard filled in around them at the ordinary hour, the way it always did, cadets from 40 worlds drifting into their morning muster lines, and the ranking board on the east wall still read, for one more day, Draycott, E above Vhorren, K, 2 names that the entire Combine had spent 6 weeks watching not fight in the ordinary yard, and 1 long minute watching almost die together on the proving sand instead. Kaelyth picked up a practice blade, tested its weight, and looked at Eli across the ring one more time, not with the flattened, humiliated readiness she'd worn every morning for 41 days straight, and not with the sick white terror that had drained her crest on the proving sand, but with something that had taken those 2 things, burned through them, and come out the other side looking almost like patience. "Teach me the reversal," she said. "The real one, not the version I nearly killed you learning wrong. That's going to take longer than 1 morning." "I have," Kaelyth said, settling into her stance, feet finding the grooves his own drills had worn into that patch of sand across 6 weeks of dawns neither of them had missed. "As many mornings as it takes. I intend to spend every one of them Somewhere behind them, Vhorren rang the bell, and for the first time in 6 weeks, neither of them was waiting for a reset call. It was, in every way that counted, only the beginning of the part that was actually going to be hard. The Directorate's ruling on the proving itself came through a week after Sora Vhorren's ship cleared the anchorage. Relayed to Arden's cadet boards in the flat procedural language the Assembly used for everything. The interrupted proving between Cadet Vhorren and Cadet Draycott was voided as contested, the ranking board frozen at its prior standing pending completion, and a resumed proving full ceremony, live edge, rebuilt wards under new triple redundant oversight, scheduled for the first morning of the next cycle, 6 weeks out. 6 weeks was, Kaelyth understood within a day of reading the ruling, both a mercy and a verdict. A mercy because it gave her time to become someone capable of actually winning a bout instead of surviving one. A verdict because everyone from the Assembly Proctor to the Kaelyth, watching from wherever their disgrace had banished them, to would be counting the same 6 weeks, waiting to see whether what had almost happened on the sand had taught her anything at all. She trained every morning before muster and every evening after it, and for the first 2 weeks, it was worse than losing. Eli started her over from the ground up, not her forms, which were already better than most of the yards, but the assumptions underneath them, the ones her mother's reputation and 6 weeks of humiliation had built into her without her noticing. He made her run the false low line 40 times in a single morning until her legs shook, not because the feint itself was wrong, but because she was still throwing it like a girl trying to prove something to a woman in a tier, instead of like a duelist solving a geometry problem that happened to have a person standing in it. "You're still fighting your mother," he told her the 4th morning when her feint arrived a half-second too eager for the 3rd time in a row. "I can see her in your shoulders. Get her out of your shoulders. That's not something you get to just decide to do." "No," he agreed. "It's something you train until your body stops doing it without asking your mind for permission. Same as everything else." The 3rd week broke something loose that neither of them had expected. Kaelyth, exhausted, furious at a drill she'd failed for the 9th consecutive morning, threw her practice blade into the sand hard enough that it stood upright, quivering, and said, quietly, which for her was the dangerous register, that she didn't understand why she was doing any of this if the only version of winning that mattered to anyone watching was putting him on the ground the way she'd almost actually done with a live edge. "Eli didn't pick the blade up for her, because that's not the version that's going to matter to you," he said. "Not anymore. You already found out what it costs to want it that badly. You felt it go into my arm instead of stopping where it should have. If you're still training to relive that, you should stop right now, because I'm not interested in helping you get better at almost killing me a 2nd time." She stood in the sand for a long moment, breathing hard, and then picked the blade back up herself, which he'd been waiting for without saying so. "Then what am I training for?" she said. "For the part where you land a clean touch on someone who's actually trying to stop you, and it costs neither of you anything you didn't choose to spend." He reset his own stance. "That's the whole art. Everything else is just fear wearing a sword." By the 5th week, something in her forehand had changed in a way the yard noticed before she did, Vhorren first, watching a muster bout against a Vesen cadet ranked 4 places below her, seeing Kaelyth score a clean, decisive touch in under a minute, where she'd once have spent 5 minutes proving a point that had nothing to do with the bout in front of her. Ovid noticed next, mentioning it once to the new cadet who'd been reassigned into Threll's old bunk. The room emptied of a name nobody at Arden said out loud anymore, in the flat, uneasy tone of someone recalibrating an assumption he'd been comfortable holding for 2 cycles. Petra noticed last and said the least about it, because she'd been the one who handed Eli a scrap of data slate with 4 suspicious numbers on it, and some quiet part of her had been waiting 6 weeks to see whether the warning had actually mattered. Sora Vhorren's messages changed too, across those 6 weeks, in ways her daughter almost didn't trust at first. They stayed short. Sora Vhorren had never in her life sent a message that wasted a word, but the fourth one arrived unprompted, with no request for a status update behind it, and said only, "Yoren's reports say your forehand line has stopped announcing itself before it arrives. I taught myself the same discipline at your age, the hard way, from an instructor who broke 3 of my ribs teaching it. You are learning it from someone who broke nothing. I am not certain yet whether that makes it a lesser education, or whether it means you finally have the instructor I never did." Kaelyth read that one 3 times and then a 4th, and did not tell Eli what it said, because some things a person earned the right to keep only for themselves, at least for a while. The technique that would end up mattering most didn't arrive until the final week, and it arrived almost by accident. Kaelyth had asked Eli, on the 40th morning of the new arrangement. She'd stopped counting bouts lost and started counting mornings trained instead, which felt, privately, like the truest measure of how much had actually changed. To finally teach her the full version of the sequence her mother had used at Threbbin, the one she'd tried to copy from a single incomplete account, and had broken against him on day 43 of the old count. "I don't know the Threbbin sequence," Eli said. "I've never seen your mother fight." "Then teach me what should have happened, the version that doesn't fail on the reversal." He thought about it for longer than he thought about most things. "The account you read got the first half right. Low line, draw the weight forward, that part's sound geometry, that's why it almost worked against me twice. The part it left out is that the reversal was never supposed to be a second attack. It's supposed to be the same attack, still moving, redirected instead of restarted." He picked up a practice blade and walked her through it at a fraction of speed, joint by joint. "You keep trying to throw 2 strikes. Your mother only ever needed to throw one that changed its mind halfway through. It took her another 11 days to stop breaking the sequence at the redirect, and when she finally didn't break it, when the blade came around whole, continuous, no seam in it where a real edge could have found the half-second gap that had nearly opened Eli's arm to the bone 6 weeks earlier. He set his own blade down in the sand and didn't say anything for a moment, which from him was its own kind of verdict. "That's it," he said finally. "That's the whole thing, do that again." She did it again. And again, until the sun came up fully over the yard's east wall, and the bell rang and 600 cadets began filing in around them the way they had every morning for 3 months. Except this time, neither Kaelyth nor Eli needed a reset call to know exactly what they'd just built. The rescheduled proving filled the ceremonial yard the way the first one had, except this time the ward stones under the floor panel were new crystal, 12 of them, verified by 3 separate diagnostic crews under assembly seal, and the banners of 40 clans hung from the colonnade with the particular stillness of an audience that had already heard, in whispers and formal briefings both, exactly what had almost gone wrong the last time they gathered here. Sora Vhorren sat in the 3rd tier again, center block, and this time she was not alone in watching for something specific. Matriarch HFY had sent no representative at all, which everyone in the tiers understood as its own kind of statement, and Proctor Ves Andral of the Combine Assembly's Cadet Oversight Directorate occupied a seat 2 rows back with a data slate already open. Because the Directorate did not consider its interest in this particular rematch to have ended just because the scandal had. Kaelyth found Eli at the ring's edge, both of them in the same light ceremonial gear as before, and neither of them looked at the tiers this time. 6 weeks, she said. Feels longer. Feels shorter to me. She turned her practice blade over once, a live edge now, unsheathed, resting flat across both palms the way ceremony demanded before the call, and looked at him steadily. Whatever happens on this sand, I already know the part that mattered happened in the yard, on mornings nobody was watching. This is just the part everyone else needed to see. That's the healthiest thing you've said to me since day one. Don't get used to it. Something moved at the edge of her mouth that hadn't been there in the old, humiliated version of herself. "I still intend to make you work for it." The horn sounded. Vhorren's voice carried the ceremonies, opening the way it always had: ring positions, live edge, proving rules. Except this time his flat professional register cracked, just slightly, on the cadets' names, in a way that told anyone who knew him well enough to hear it that he considered this particular bout worth more than the ceremony script allowed him to say out loud. They came together on the horn's second note, and for the first 4 exchanges, the yard watched something it had never once seen in 3 months of the standoff: an actual contest. Kaelyth opened with a real attack, not a feint built to fail, a direct line to the outside line of his guard, fast enough that Eli had to actually move his feet instead of simply redirecting her wrist. And when he answered with a counter of his own, testing, controlled, she read it and turned it aside with a parry clean enough that a ripple of sound went through the tiers. 40 clans worth of cadets and delegates suddenly leaning forward at once. It wasn't a touch. It was, for the first time in the history of the ranking board, an actual exchange of blades between first and second, both of them trying, both of them capable, and the sand between them filled with motion, instead of the careful, one-sided stillness everyone had learned to expect. Eli scored the first touch of the bout at the 2-minute mark, a controlled tap to her outer thigh, textbook, exactly the kind of clean, economical strike he'd spent 6 weeks teaching her to both throw and defend against, and the ward field didn't so much as flicker because there was nothing for it to arrest. Vhorren called it clean. The board would, for the first time in 6 weeks, show a scored touch. Kaelyth didn't let the sting of it slow her down. She trained for this exact moment more than any other. The moment where being behind on the board didn't mean being behind on the fight, and she answered inside 20 seconds with a touch of her own, a fast redirect off his own counter that caught his forearm above the wrist, clean, controlled, deliberate. The ward field humming a soft acknowledgement tone that every cadet in that yard had heard exactly 0 times in 6 weeks of the standoff. The tears went, briefly, entirely silent, and then loud in a way the ceremonial yard hadn't been since before the proving had a scandal attached to its name. They traded 3 more touches across the next 4 minutes. Eli 2, Kaelyth 1, the board keeping a real score for the first time either of their names had ever appeared on it together. And Kaelyth understood, somewhere in the 3rd exchange, that she was not going to outpower him, and had never needed to, because the entire 6 weeks of training had never been about matching his strength. It had been about matching his patience, the same total economy of motion she'd first recognized on day 49 of the old count and been frightened by, right up until the moment she'd finally understood that patience was a thing that could be taught instead of just inherited. The 5th minute was the one that mattered. Eli opened a line to her inside guard, testing, the same controlled probe he'd used a dozen times already, and Kaelyth let it come the way she trained herself to let it come: patient, unhurried, watching the geometry instead of the man. And at the exact half-second where the old her would have reversed too early, wait forward, telegraphing the whole sequence the way she had every single morning for 6 weeks under Vhorren's gray-eyed patience, she didn't reverse. She let the strike keep moving. The blade came around whole, continuous, no seam in it for a live edge to find the true thread-in line, redirected instead of restarted, exactly the way Eli had walked her through it joint by joint on a morning 6 weeks ago that already felt like it belonged to someone she used to be. And it crossed the ward's threshold a finger width from Eli's collarbone at a speed his 6 weeks of teaching her had built, and his own reflexes, honed against 41 mornings of her old patterns, weren't quite braced to expect from the new one. The field caught it clean on time, exactly as designed, new crystal, verified 3 times over, nothing wrong with it this time at all, and stopped her blade a finger width out with the soft blue shimmer and the acknowledgement tone that meant, under proving rules that had governed this ring for 300 years, a scored and validated touch. For 1 full second, Nobody in the ceremonial yard made a sound, for a very different reason than the last time this ring had gone silent. Then Vhorren's voice cut across the quiet, and it did not sound like ceremony at all. Touch confirmed. Clean line, full validation. He looked at the two of them for a moment before he said the rest of it, and when he did, it carried to every tier at once. Bout to Cadet Vhorren. Board reshuffles as of this hour. Eli lowered his sword arm, breathing hard for the first time in 6 months of anyone watching him fight, and looked at her with an expression she'd catalogued across 3 months of mornings and had never once seen him wear. Something that had nothing careful left in it at all. "There it is," he said. "I nearly missed the redirect." "You didn't miss it. That's the whole point." He stepped back, sheathing his blade, and for a moment the noise of 600 cadets finding their voices at once nearly swallowed what he said next, so that only she heard it. "6 weeks ago I told you the actual winning wasn't mine to hand you. It still isn't. But I got to watch you take it, which is better than handing it over ever would have been." In the third tier, Sora Vhorren had risen to her feet without seeming to notice she'd done it, and her crest, steel gray, unreadable, the same color it had held through 11 engagements and 17 years of a daughter who had never once heard her say the word proud out loud, was not steel gray anymore. It had gone to a warm, deep gold that every V-haster in that yard recognized on sight, and that none of them had ever seen on a Vhorren, because War-Matriarch Sora Vhorren did not deal in things that weren't yet earned, and had just watched her daughter earn, in one continuous, unbroken line of motion, the exact thing 6 weeks of cold, clipped messages had been trying to teach her to want for herself instead of for anyone watching from a tier. Proctor Andral, 2 rows back, closed her data slate without writing anything further on it, which was, from a combine assembly proctor, as close to a compliment as her position allowed. Vhorren called the ring clear, and the board on the ceremonial yard's east wall, a temporary duplicate of the one bolted to the ordinary yard, kept synchronized by assembly mandate for exactly this kind of moment, updated in front of every clan delegation present. First Blade Vhorren, K. Second Blade Draycott, E**. Sora Vhorren found her daughter an hour later, once the delegations had thinned, and the marshals had finished their formal notarization of the board change, standing at the edge of the sand with Eli a few paces off, both of them still in ceremonial gear, both of them looking, for the first time since Kaelyth had enrolled at Arden, like they'd stopped bracing for something. "You broke the reversal early on the 5th exchange," Sora said, without greeting, because she had never once in her life led with anything but the thing that actually mattered. "On purpose. You wanted him to think you were still throwing the old pattern." "I wanted him to trust the last 6 weeks of his own teaching for half a second longer than he should have." Kaelyth met her mother's eyes and did not look away first, which was, in itself, a thing that hadn't been true 9 weeks ago. "He built my forehand. I used what he built against the exact moment he'd have expected the old version of me to fail. That felt like the only honest way to win it." Something that was not quite a smile moved across Sora Vhorren's face, brief, almost startled by its own presence there. "That's the Threbin line," she said, "properly finished. I've watched 3 officers try to teach it in the years since and fail because they taught the strike and not the patience underneath it." She looked past her daughter briefly to where Eli stood pretending not to listen. "First Blade Draycott taught you the patience. He taught me it was learnable. I did the rest at 4 in the morning, when nobody was watching either of us." "That's the correct answer," Sora said, "and also, I suspect, not the whole answer, and I find I don't mind that as much as I would have expected to." She reached out, an unfamiliar gesture, one Kaelyth couldn't remember her mother making since she was small enough to need lifting over doorsteps, and set 2 fingers briefly against her daughter's shoulder. The same unhurried, deliberate touch Eli had used to guide a wild blade wide of his ribs on the very first morning of the old count, though neither of them would ever tell her that. I said before the last proving that I'd rather you lost honestly to something you didn't understand than won by pretending you already did. You did neither in the end. You understood it and you won anyway. I don't have a message for that. I only have this, which is the truest thing I have ever said to you. I am proud of you, Kaelyth. Not of the rank. Of the 6 weeks it took you to stop needing it to mean something it was never going to mean. She left for the transit platform an hour after that, Threben's answer lifting from Kesho's dock before the ceremonial yard had even finished clearing. And this time she did not send a 4-line message once she was underway. She sent one line, 3 days out, that Kaelyth read exactly once and then saved somewhere she'd never delete it from. Proud of you. Keep training. Both of you. The yard filled in around them at the ordinary hour the next morning, the way it always did, cadets from 40 worlds drifting into their muster lines under a board that read, for the first time in Kaelyth Vhorren's life, a name at the top that she had put there herself with a blade instead of a bloodline. She picked up a practice blade, tested its weight, and looked across the ring at the boy who had spent 6 weeks teaching her exactly enough to beat him, and not one motion more than that, because he'd understood before she had, that the only victory worth having was the one that cost neither of them anything they hadn't chosen to spend. Second blade, she said, and there was no bitterness left anywhere in the word, only the plain fact of it and something that might have been anticipation. Same time tomorrow. Same time tomorrow, Eli said. Try not to make it too easy on me. I have a reputation to maintain. You have exactly 6 weeks of reputation left before I take that from you too. Then I'd better teach you the rest of what I know, he said, before you run out of things to learn from me. Somewhere behind them, Vhorren rang the bell, and for the first time since either of them had set foot in that ring, the sound didn't mean the start of another morning spent proving something to people watching from a tier. It just meant it was time to fight, the way it was supposed to, 2 cadets who had already earned the right to call each other equal, with nothing left to reset.